Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and it has been quite a stretch for Jesus at the movies lately, between kind of the breakout hit Father Stew and then the kind of the box office success of the Chosen. There's been a lot of kind of faith-based films that have been kind of making a name for themselves, making a mark, kind of reaching a wider audience. And the latest Jesus Revolution kind of seems like it has all the makings to follow suit in that way. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So the two films I mentioned at the start, Father Stew and The Chosen, in some ways those are good comparables for Jesus Revolution. It's kind of falls somewhat in the middle of that. It even features the actor who plays Jesus in The Chosen playing the character in Jesus Revolution who looks like Jesus and is supposed to. So good casting on that one. But it kind of has like the kind of like Father Stew, some of the more like gritty. Kind of like the drug culture and the hippie culture, and a little bit more of like the grittiness to it, and like kind of the messiness of life, like the Father Stew movie tried to do, while also very much having kind of the more traditional faith-based, kind of message-driven teaching. Kind of inspirational stuff that the Chosen has. And so if you're not familiar with this film, it's set kind of in the late 1970s, based on true life events, as it explains at the start of this film, of how God and kind of came into the hippie movement of the 70s, and revival spread, kind of this Jesus revolution that spread kind of all across the country. And was featured in Time magazine, and this big movement. It's kind of following, kind of based on those events, and a lot of like historical stuff that really happened that they kind of dramatize in this. And even kind of despite being set in several decades ago, it's almost surprising how relevant and timely this movie feels with some of the revivals and things happening on college campuses. This film definitely feels like it's arriving right at the right time. And I'll say there's a lot of things I liked about this movie. I'm typically not really the kind of person that enjoys faith-based films, and we'll get into some of that in a second. Hey, I'm thrilled that they're made. I'm thrilled that people enjoy them. I just typically don't enjoy that kind of film. I like a bit more like the messiness and exploring a little more ambiguous stuff rather than the more kind of didactic teaching, kind of Bible study based films. But I did like a lot about this film. I think it is an important message. I think this is a film that a lot of Christians and a lot of people in the church are very much going to be moved by and inspired by. I think people in my theater, as they were very vocal during the showing to let everyone know they were being moved and inspired by this thing. So I do think this is an important film, although whether it's like a good film, I think is a bit trickier to kind of untangle. But let's get into this. So Jesus Revolution, I would say is mostly a one-note story, although it plays that one note very well. Kind of like a lot of faith-based films. It kind of straggles the line between sermon and movie, and sometimes becomes tricky to kind of like untangle where one ends and the other begins. Kind of has those two elements going at it, which makes these films sometimes tricky to review and to approach. And kind of something that came to mind during my showing, there was sort of a teaching moment that was happening. And someone a few rows ahead of me very vocally, yelled out "Amen" as the character was like delivering some very, some biblical truth. And I think that sort of symbolizes some of the trickiness of these sorts of films, where, as I was watching it, very much affirming, the power of the message of what was being said, while also thinking that the actual like delivery and like the way the scene was constructed, and like the over the top kind of emotional music wasn't necessarily well done. It was kind of cheesy, and this seems sort of like almost manufactured, that they're trying to make this a very emotional moment, and it didn't feel authentic to the characters. But the actual message that was being said was very powerful. So you almost need to kind of separate the two, kind of look at the themes and the message of this film, which are central, and I do think are very powerful. And we'll get into that in the themes, kind of worldview stuff in this review. Well, I think also being honest about the movie itself, and recognizing that, hey, there are some flaws. There are definitely some good elements to this movie, but there are also shortcomings and things that that, at least for me, just didn't quite connect. So like I said, this is very much a message film. Kind of thought of like the trope back in like the 90s, kind of family sitcoms like Full House, where you always know, like, when the parent sits down with the kids and like the emotional music swells, and like you all know like a teaching moment's about to happen. They're going to have some reconciliation, or the dad's going to deliver some encouragement to his daughter, or whatever it might be. And in a lot of ways, Jesus Revolution is kind of 2 hours of those scenes. Is very much, almost every scene kind of leads to sort of one of those moments where the music swells again, and the characters are delivering kind of very preachy. And some of that's unavoidable just given the subject matter, focusing on a church and a pastor. You're going to get sermons, you're going to get preaching, you're going to get the conversations that happen obviously are tailor-made to have those conversations. So some of it does feel authentic, even if it is sort of preachy. Those moments themselves aren't necessarily bad. I think there's a lot of good messaging that is happening, but I just felt it to be a little too much. I kind of enjoyed that note for the first hour, and by the second hour, when it just seemed like every scene, just kind of the whole film just sort of was this a series of sort of emotional, biblically sound teaching, it became a little bit too much for me. Although there are good things as far as this movie goes. There are some moments of like inspiration, particularly there's a scene where a character gets baptized, and it kind of like shifts as he goes under the water and becomes sort of this like visual metaphor where he's under the water and he's kind of reaching up to the light. And it's sort of one of those rare moments in this film where it seems the film is like trusting to communicate sort of its message in a way other than just having characters kind of directly say it to each other and kind of vicariously saying it to the audience. And the characters themselves, they're all good across the board. There really isn't weak acting. None of the problems that I had with this film are related to the characters or the acting. There's kind of good characters, and a lot of the best moments that happen are kind of the moments that happen between like the emotional teaching moments, where characters can just sort of interact with each other, and it feels a little more kind of authentic to how they're doing, rather than kind of feeling a bit of the burden of we need to have this teaching moment and kind of connect to the Bible study resource or whatever it might be. So there is some kind of clever some clever filming and good acting across the board that does sort of have a chance to shine kind of between some of the more sort of forced moments. As far as content to consider, things going on kind of on the surface of this film, not a whole lot. It is refreshing, and that's typically not the case with sort of more of the mainstream movies. Language, no language beyond maybe I think a character calls another character like an idiot or something like that, but no profanity that I heard. Sexuality, no sexuality. One character does mention kind of his experiences as part of like the hippie movement, where he says, they did everything and everyone, obviously implying, as several other characters do, to sort of kind of being sexually promiscuous and some of that, but you don't see that, and it's very much talked about in a kind of in a wholesome manner of that was wrong and that was sin and that was destructive. It doesn't glorify that by any means. Violence, no real violence. There is sort of a scene where a character sort of ODs on drugs and starts like foaming out of the mouth and kind of convulsing a bit, and but ultimately she's okay. And then there's a character that gets in a car crash, but you don't see really the aftermath or kind of any of like the bruises, and they also are okay. So nothing on that end. And maybe this is a movie that's dealing with the hippie culture, so it is also dealing with the drug culture. You have a lot of that characters talking about drugs kind of all throughout this. You have sort of one scene where characters are sort of all on they're all tripping out, and it's sort of psychedelic and just filmed in sort of, kind of a real weird, kind of blurry way, and you kind of see them experiencing that experience. But again, this film clearly is not endorsing that. It's treating that kind of as seriously as it should, but just be aware that is a prominent part in this film. As far as themes, kind of some of the message of this, again, this is where the movie, I think, excels. This is definitely its strength and kind of the themes and stuff that it weaves throughout this movie. The first one is just sort of spiritually seeking. Kind of right at the start of this film, one of the characters, it starts like near the end of the movement and then flashes back to tell how they got there. And a reporter is asking one of the leaders of the movement kind of to describe this Jesus movement. And he kind of explains it, says, hey, it's not something that you describe. It is something that you experience. And that's kind of the through line of this whole film, is this sort of different characters from different kind of parts of life and for different reasons, kind of how they're all seeking the truth. They all kind of find meaning and purpose and kind of acceptance in this sort of Jesus movement in the Bible and kind of the gospel that sets free. And it very much has a positive message towards spiritual seekers, kind of rather than the old churchgoers who just sort of want their comfort and they're worried about the carpet of their church, and it's like a dying church, and they're just upset about the younger generations, and they're hopeless, and they're all just into drugs and stuff, and there's no helping them, and they have no place in our church. We have standards, and the film very much is a message that, hey, that those things are wrong, but that's a positive, that they're doing those because they're searching for something. They're searching for God. They're searching in the wrong places, or as kind of one of the leaders of the hippie movement says, they're sheep without a shepherd. And the verse that came to mind for me with Matthew 7:7, where it says, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you." And this very much seems like a verse that the film itself takes inspiration from, because they do kind of play off the idea of the church being an open door, not closing the door. Anyone's welcome to come. Anyone who's seeking for truth can find it there. So that's kind of one positive message in this film. Maybe the other kind of main theme that goes kind of all throughout this is just sort of the family of God, kind of finding acceptance in faith in God, kind of that even outcast, no matter how far you've gone, you can find belonging. You can kind of find your people, as one of the characters says. Because one of the refrains that goes throughout this movie is, everyone leaves eventually. This sort of the sense that different circumstances, different people, different walks of life, but all these characters have felt various ways like abandonment or outcast, or they don't fit in, or they're not understood. And that they can find kind of acceptance in sort of this Christian, this Jesus revolution, this movement. Obviously, Galatians 3:28, there is no Jew or Gentile, or male, female, all that, of just, hey, here under this tent, sort of this revival tent, like we are one. Maybe one, I won't say it was a negative, but just something to consider with this is that it is very much sort of about this Jesus movement, this kind of God movement, but God himself kind of is somewhat absent in sort of this story. It is very much kind of focused on this movement and like on the family of God, rather than necessarily a whole lot of like God himself. You don't really see the characters necessarily finding like acceptance or like developing a relationship with God. It's more they're developing sort of a community of people that are that are like-minded, more kind of being accepted rather than repentance or kind of the full gospel in that sense. Although the film does address that, it does sort of at the end of the film kind of show the dangers of focusing just on the movement, and that if your faith just in the movement, you're going to be let down just like you were before. That really the true power and like belonging comes from God, not just sort of in the publicity and the emotions of the moment. So I don't think the film necessarily is endorsing anything harmful, but maybe just doesn't emphasize that element maybe as much as it could have. So in the end, I like this movie. I think it's a good movie for what it's trying to be. It's a good faith-based film. I think it struggles in some of the same ways that I think a lot of faith-based films do, where there's just a little too much emphasis on making this sort of an evangelical message and kind of making sure that it's very clear that audiences take away what the filmmakers want them to, rather than just sort of trusting the story and letting the characters sort of drive the narrative rather than kind of the message to it. And I do think near the end of the film, it starts getting into a little bit more depth and kind of nuance, and things start going directions that a little less predictable as the start. But I did think it's almost ironic in a sense that this film feels a little too square for the film that it's for the story that it's telling. That it very much is sort of told in a way that these hippie characters would think is too uptight, too restrained, rather than just sort of getting into the real messiness of life and people. But hey, I think this is a film that a lot of Christians are going to enjoy. Hopefully a lot of non-Christians also check it out and just get a good picture of, hey, what's the church all about? Because I think this film definitely showcases at least sort of the family of God aspect of what Christianity is. But if you guys check this movie out, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to have a conversation. If you enjoyed it, if you were inspired by it, if you see sort of a lot of relevance for what this film is saying with kind of our current cultural moment, would love to have that conversation. And if you haven't done so, guys, I encourage you, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, and just sort of join with what we're doing here. We'd love to have you. But thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.